Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Sarah Cannon, a senior SOAN major. I grew up sensitized to feminist theology and the struggles that women face in being faith leaders because my mother is a minister. With this background, I'm especially honored to be able to introduce today's convo speaker, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, who in 1981 became the first woman ordained in the Jewish renewal movement and found a place in history as one of the first 10 women in Jewish history to become a rabbi. She has served a congregation as a rabbi for 34 years. As amazing as this is, it's obvious that Gottlieb's passions extend beyond gender issues. Throughout her career, she has devoted herself to interfaith peacemaking. She co-founded the Muslim-Jewish PeaceWalk and has co-organized 16 PeaceWalk gatherings throughout the United States and Canada. She directs Interfaith Inventions Wilderness Peace Camps, is a national council member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a performing artist, and an author and a peace activist. Throughout her work, she explores how, in an atmosphere of war and fear, people can create positive relationships that promote peace. She is also the proud mother of Nathaniel, who is, thank God, graduating from college this year. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb to Carleton College.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm not used, believe it or not, to a microphone or standing behind a dais, but I will do my best. I am very happy to be here. First, I want to say Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam. Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam. Shalom aleichem. Aleichem shalom. Bienvenidos. And I'm sure there are other languages of greetings here from the many people who make up the community of Carleton College. I am speaking today about my journey to Islam, and I hope that I can give justice and beauty and appropriate dignity to the religion of Islam, speaking as I am from the Jewish tradition. And so, just so that you know, I'm not going to try to explain Islam to you. That hopefully you will, those of you who have not had the opportunity and extreme pleasure to interact with members of the Muslim community. Hopefully this will encourage you to seek that out. I also hope that I can give dignity and honor to my own tradition, which I always try to do. And I am speaking for myself. I am not speaking as a representative of the Jewish community. I want to begin by saying, of course, as in all communities, wherever we are on earth, there is tremendous diversity of opinion and feelings, even though there may be a wide swath of common practice. For instance, Jewish people everywhere, pretty much, most of us, will be celebrating Passover this coming full moon, which is just around the corner. And for all the millions of Jewish people who will be celebrating Passover, if you would go from house to house, as Rabbi Sho said last night, one of the most common questions you will hear is, when are we going to eat? But beyond that, you will find, and there's even stories about that, which maybe I'll tell you later. Beyond that, there's a tremendous diversity of celebration. My own lineage, therefore, I want to speak of my own lineage so that you know where I'm coming from. I am Miriam Bat Sivia Bat Bessie, Bat Delia, Bat Jenny, Bat Henrietta, and Henrietta came to Easton, Pennsylvania in the 1860s. I am, ladies and gentlemen, an American Jew. I am an American Jew. My family has been here for 6 generations, and we came, most of us German Jewish, some Lithuanian, so I am that Euro-Mutt Jew, you know, combination of many places. All of my relatives came here seeking a better life, and for the most part, they found it. My family goes back so far that we have these amazing stories about how American history intersected with Judaism, including the wildest tale that I was told by one of my great-great cousins that somehow Abraham Lincoln died in my great-great-great-grandmother's sister's arms. It's a totally wild and ridiculous story, but it just goes to how long my family has been here long enough to make up stories like this. That is my family lineage, German Jewish. And my spiritual lineage is through rabbis who practiced nonviolence. Now, most rabbis, at least in their regular daily lives, do practice nonviolence. But although some kids have, older Jewish adults have told me various rabbi stories, which I don't want to repeat here, about being yelled at in religious school. But I'm talking about, and that also goes to nonviolence, but I'm talking about active nonviolence, that is people who are pacifists, people who believe that war is a form of institutional and structural violence that by a matter of faith, belief, the rabbis that I come from do not believe that, do not have faith in that, and as a matter of faith principle, have become pacifists. And when I say pacifists, about a week ago, there was a shooting on Drown Street in the town where I live, and the community that knows my work brought me in to facilitate a community meeting to try to figure out, to let people sort of express their feelings about it, and then to try to work on a strategy of response. And somebody came up to me at the very end and said, I just hate pacifists. They just go undercover and try to pretend that love is going to take care of everything. And I know that many people think that sort of pacifist is passive, but it is anything but passive. Gandhi was not passive. Martin Luther King, and both their names, may their memories be a blessing, was not passive. They were active. They took on the role of transforming the structural violence of racism in this country and in India through action. Proactive nonviolence is really the lineage that I come from. And so the rabbis that trained me, all of them have spent time in jail, which I also have. And that's really the least of it, you know. And so nonviolence for me really came out of, and this is part of my lineage, growing up, being the first generation to grow up after the Holocaust, after the Shoah. And so when I was growing up as an 11 and 12-year-old, slowly I began to realize that something horrible had happened to the Jewish people. And in a very short period of time, I realized that 1/3 of Jewish people living on earth were murdered. And this is rather perplexing, isn't it, for a child to begin to understand the depth of violence and cruelty that is possible, and somehow that so many people, millions and millions of people, obviously not just Jewish people, but that in the Holocaust and in other places, 2 million gypsies, or the Roma people as they prefer to be called, so many millions of people were murdered, while what happened, even to the extent of learning about the boat of Jewish people, the very famous boat of Jewish people, the St. Louis, that was docking off the coast of the United States for 3 months, as the Germans just put over 300 Jews in a boat and said, go ahead, go try to find some place. And no place in the world would take this group of refugees. And so they were shipped back and murdered. So that really lit a fire underneath me as a young person. And when you're experiencing this awareness, there are many possible reactions. One is that you're going to pick up a gun and go fight and get revenge. And for many reasons that didn't really seem like a viable option in my life, although I came close. And I'll talk about that in a second. But at the same time that I was learning about all of this from, I might say, people face to face. So learning about genocide for me was not something very distant, but people in my community who had numbers on their arms and so forth, and told me stories that I really had no place to put. Where do you put these just terrible stories that people have experienced so much grief, so much loss of everything they knew and loved, everyone they knew and loved, everything gone. So at the same time that was going on, I experienced the civil rights movement. And thank God the rabbis in my life were all going to jail in Birmingham and other places, and were all riled up about civil rights and gave the youth in my community, including me, the opportunity to speak out and to be active and to go to the March on Washington and to become part of the great human rights movement of the African American community and those who allied themselves for the struggle for human rights, as Reverend James Lawson says, much more than civil rights, human rights. And this, of course, is an ongoing struggle, as we know. But at the time, when I was young, this gave me the idea that if you saw an injustice, and this is a thing that we all preach from the pulpit, I'm sure those of you who've been involved in religious life have heard it in your tradition, that you can't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor while your neighbor's blood is being shed. So this got me thinking in terms of my long-range thinking, and this has really been my entire life since then, what is it that prevents and dismantles structural violence? And where does structural violence live? And what is my role in structural violence? And as a white Jewish person, this meant that I had to come to terms with my part in the racism of America. Even though my ancestors did not own slaves, nonetheless, I began to realize over time that I was enjoying the privileges and opportunities that came with being a white person, and became more and more aware of structural violence and how that impacts our relationships. So this is kind of a heavy burden, true, for a young person, but it seemed to me that lives were on the line, and I did not want to be a party to perpetuating violence in any form. And given the tremendous examples of Gandhi and the Danish nation, who created a nonviolent response to Hitler and saved almost the entire nation of Jews. And the village of Chambon, which I learned about, that also saved a whole village. And they were trained by the Fellowship of Reconciliation. So I joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation when I was in my mid-20s, and I learned about the huge community, international community of hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people all around the world who, like me, are committed to nonviolence, active, proactive nonviolence, to transform, dismantle, and disengage from, not cooperate with, all of the structures of institutional violence that permit some people on this earth to suffer and work so hard but gain none of the privileges that accrue to the more privileged. So this is kind of where I'm coming from. So my journey into Islam began, and this isn't so much the part I'm going to talk about. I'm really going to talk post 9/11 because it's more current and fresh, and I've done more in that regard. But I want to mention the fact that my journey to Islam began in 1966 when I spent my first year as an exchange student in Israel, in Haifa. And when I was in Israel, of course, as a Jewish kid, I learned the Jewish narrative about Israel and the idea that somehow Israel was a people without a land, and Israel was a land without a people. That was Golda Meir's statement. But already in 1966, just going up the hill, in Jerusalem, I saw these lights on the side. I'm asking Zev El-Na'i, the most famous guide, pretty much invented the idea of being a guide and tourism and so forth in Israel, who was our guide. It's a tremendous opportunity. Who lives there? You know, because he was saying, you know, on this hill, David did this and Jacob did that, and this is where the Syrians were, you know, those are Syrian tanks, and this battle was here, and mixing the Bible and current history. So he missed those lights, you know, and like, who's that? And he's, oh, Arabs live on that hill. Like, oh, okay. Arabs live here. That was interesting to me, and I decided to investigate further. And without going into that whole story, which is kind of an amazing 17-year-old story of how I managed to encounter and interview over 50 Palestinian members of the Palestinian community, I began to have conversations in Israel with Muslims who are also Palestinian. And those conversations were more political than religious. But it first made me realize that there was another culture. And just the first thing that I experienced from that culture was a tremendous hospitality. So much hospitality that I had the opportunity to stay with families in the Galil, Palestinian families in the Galil, Muslim families. And so that was sort of my first encounter of seeing people pray and devotion in prayer and learning about hijab, which is the covering on the head covering, and that unbelievable hospitality, so hospitable that even if you notice something beautiful on the wall, it will come off the wall and end up in your hands if you notice it. And so I learned, actually, this is something I learned when traveling, is to be careful with my compliments, because people are so hospitable in so many parts of the world that if you do fancy something, you will find it in your hands, because that's what you do with an honored guest. And this idea of honored guest, I learned as I began religious dialogues with the Muslim community. I learned that Abraham, and the family of Abraham is noted for their hospitality, running to the person, I don't mean you, by the way, running, standing at the doorway, I was going to say running to the doorway to greet the person coming in with just what they might need, and doing it in such a way, and I've experienced this so many times in the Muslim world, doing it just such a way. So first you're greeted with water, and then a little bit of snack, fresh fruit and cookies, and then you're sitting down and you're eating, and that gives people enough time to start cooking you dinner. And then you've eaten dinner, but then there's after dinner and the conversation, and then, but now it's too late to go home, so you better stay here overnight, and then there's breakfast, and are you staying the week? And so it goes, and this is, for me, has become for me the first principle of Jewish nonviolence, which I call Shomer Shalom. That's what I am, a Shomeret Shalom. And this is how to make a person feel welcome. And this is a point of connection, and probably my deepest and most spiritual experience in Islam is that welcome, which I always have experienced in the Muslim community. So thank you, shukran, for that tremendous welcome. So comes 9/11, a terrible tragedy, and so much sadness, so much loss, so much suffering, confusion. And that night, I opened up the doors to my congregation, and about 150 people came. They knew, the word went out, and it wasn't only our community that came, but we are kind of a center for peacemaking. So many people from the community came, and we had a great council, which is another part of Jewish nonviolence, in which you sit in a big circle. And this is something I also like to honor the Native American community of the United States, because Indians have sat in council for many generations, and sitting in council and actively listening to each other is a real standard of interfaith dialogue and a standard of nonviolence training, active listening, to try to understand where another person's coming from before you're jumping down their throat or anything else. So you're just listening. And so we did that, and we passed something around, which we always do. It might have been a shofar at this time, because it was right before Rosh Hashanah. And everyone spoke, from the youngest to the elder, everybody. And the young people speak because they've been trained that way. So they shared their feelings, two things: who they were thinking about, and everybody had relatives or a connection, and then what else was on their hearts and mind. And to a person in my congregation, yay, my congregation, everyone said, we're afraid we're going to war, that this terrible tragedy is going to unleash the hounds of war, and we are going to go to war. And little did we know at that time, really, how that would be played out. And what can we do to protect the Muslim community in Albuquerque? And I was so happy as a rabbi for my community, to have this sentiment. And so we met together and we thought, what can we do? So the first thing that we did was invite 20 of our closest Muslim friends from the mosque, and truly they came to our synagogue. And that too, for me, is always a teaching that people are afraid sometimes to go into each other's spaces. And so we're coming back to that idea of welcome. How do you make people feel welcome in your space? So, of course, I was standing at the door with Arabic coffee, sometimes known as Armenian coffee, sometimes known as Turkish coffee, sometimes known as Greek coffee. That thick mud coffee that you let boil 3 times. And anyway, I was standing at the door so that they would feel welcome, and they did. And it was time for prayer, and so we prayed together, and my community has prayer rugs so that we can serve our guests, our Muslim guests, and make them feel at home. So they prayed, and we sat with them, and some of us joined them. And then the question was, how does your faith as a Muslim help you respond to 9/11? And in that question, my congregation learned, many of them for the first time, of a Muslim response to 9/11, which of course was filled with great sorrow for the victims, and then the teachings that come with Islam about the fact that we are all created, as the surah said, men and women, we're all created differently, so that Allah created us all differently, so that we may come to know each other, and that we may struggle together for goodness. Let us compete in goodness. That this is the heart of Islam. This is the true jihad. This is what we learn, that the true jihad is the struggle for the heart of goodness in our souls. And we learn what it means to submit your will to Allah, which is what is required of us in submitting our spiritual will to the will of Allah, is to seek justice for the oppressed, and even in conflict, to strive to forgive, and to keep the 5 pillars so that one can walk a pure life. Well, this certainly isn't the message that, we get in the media about jihad, but the message that I've always heard from the Muslims that I've dialogued with and been friends with is this message, the message that to struggle for one's own heart in the service of good is what Islam means. And so after that, it still quite wasn't enough. And just after that, there was the March incursion in Israel and Palestine, and people had kind of come to the mosque and talked and reached out to the mosque in the first week or 2 or 3, but then things pulled back. And I was hearing from other friends that the FBI was coming to every mosque in America and trying to designate people as, listeners to report. And if there is an agent here, hi. It's been my experience from time to time, to report on any possible issues or problems happening. So we were thinking, well, what can we do actually to make a bigger statement than just bringing folks to, and then we had the Hiroshima Flame Pilgrimage. This is a whole other story. They were walking across the United States carrying the flame of Hiroshima, giving witness to the impact of the nuclear industry on indigenous lands, walked from Chief Seattle's grave on Martin Luther King Day all the way to the UN. Anyway, I got a phone call that said, Rabbi Lynn, we're coming through. Can we stay at your place? And they meant my synagogue, and I was like, sure, come on. So we had this amazing, we walked with them, and Myohoji pilgrims, they're serious. You're walking 18 miles a day. Anyway, we had this amazing peace pilgrimage, and I realized that I'd been on many pilgrimages in my life, of all different sorts, and that what a perfect thing for us to do would be to walk to the masjid as a peace pilgrim and peace pilgrimage to show our solidarity with the masjid. So we I decided I'd call up the mosque. And I wasn't exactly sure who was in that role these days. I didn't know the president, so I asked a friend of mine, Ahmed Lobad, who I should call, and he told me, call the president or call the vice president. I called the president, and the line was busy. And so I called Abdul Rauf Campos Marchetti, and I got him on the phone. That in itself is a miracle, because I don't think I've ever gotten him on the phone directly since. But that day, I got him on the telephone, and I said, Assalamu alaikum, and he said, Wa alaikum salam, and I said, my name is Rabbi Lynn, have you heard of me? He said no, and I'm thinking, oh, this is great. This is going to be out of the blue. And I said, well, my congregation, I explained a little bit who I was, and I didn't really have to, and my congregation wants to walk to the masjid in peace this coming Saturday. It was 5 days away. And he said, Alhamdulillah, what a beautiful idea. Praise God. Let's walk in peace. And 5 days later, there were 350 people in front of my synagogue from every religious community in New Mexico, including Native American, Baha'i, Hindu, Shia and Sunni together, of course Jewish people, and a large sect of the Catholic and Protestant community, and old and young, people even with one person pushing their oxygen tank, on wheels, and we had 5 peace bands ready to go, and we walked 6.6 miles, which took about 3 some hours, from my congregation to the masjid, where we were greeted by amazed faces of people who were welcoming us. And it was picked up on CNN and the media. And the next year, we were invited to 16 different places to walk together. And every place that we went, every single place that we went, the Muslim community greeted us and welcomed us and made a place for us. And it wasn't always easy to do that, because there's always suspicion about what it means to be in dialogue with people from the other communities. And people sometimes think you're betraying them if you make friends with the wrong people on every side. So I realized too that the Muslims that I met showed tremendous courage to reach out, because it's not easy to be Muslim in this country. There are so many stereotypes, and over the next year and throughout the year, I learned about these stereotypes and how painful they were. And I'd like to just share 2 of them, because I work with young people, and we always have a prejudice circle at a certain point, especially in the wilderness peace camps, where kids share their experience of prejudice. And one young man from Yemen said that after 9/11, his best friend's parents told his best friend that he could no longer speak with him. And he said, but my best friend didn't pay attention, and he spoke with me anyway. And then he burst out into tears and said, but my sister sat alone. No one would talk to her in her school. That is an overwhelming burden for a young person to bear that kind of prejudice, as many of you know, who have borne it yourselves. Another young woman, I've had many adventures with hijab, many. I've learned 100 ways to tie a hijab, and it's been one of the most beautiful experiences that I've had with other women, with Muslim women, who will teach me their way of putting on hijab before I enter the masjid to pray with them, so that I am attired well. And I remember especially going to Philadelphia, and I'll tell you that a little bit, and going into Al-Aqsa Mosque, where we are celebrating our 4th year of the PeaceWalk. We're going back, and there's an ongoing community there. And I walked in, and all the kids looked at my hijab and started laughing at me because my hair was sticking out, and it was really not tied right. I just did not have it. And Adab took me aside, and she took off the one that I had on my head, which was way too thick for me. And she gave me another one, and she put it on, and everybody went, now this is right. And I began to learn about hijab, of course, from many feminist Muslims that I've met, that hijab is not just only for them a matter of spiritual identity and modesty, but also a way now to be a proud Muslim person. And I have met many women, young women, who have started their lives without hijab here in the United States, and at a certain point, often in college, decided to take it on so that they can feel whole in themselves. But Suzanne, who was one of the counselors, did not wear hijab, and so she said, so I'm kind of protected from the daily harassment. But she said, I see my sisters who get harassed all the time. And there's an assumption that somehow women who are wearing hijab that women in Islam altogether are oppressed by this. And she said, it's not true. And then she said, and my father is she's Syrian, my father is one of my biggest supporters. And Yaqub, who's also there, a Sufi, a Palestinian Sufi from many generations in Palestine, Sufis from many generations. And she mentioned Yaqub's father, are so loving toward women. And in fact, the Prophet Muhammad, may his memory be a blessing, one of his greatest enactments was to protect the women of his time and to urge certain kinds of rights for the women in his community. And she began to cry, and I realized just how deep and automatic our prejudice is, that if we see a woman who's covered in hijab, we assume things. We assume things, and we have no right to those assumptions unless we are willing to engage in conversation. And then the other piece is, so many women have told me they experienced this. Why do you wear a hijab? Like that. Instead of another way of asking the question, which might be, what does hijab mean to you? So instead of challenging, that's about the stupidest thing you could do, and to assume that as women, as white women or women of color, that we're not carrying our own burden of structural sexism in this society, that we have our own versions of it. They might be different. But to make those kinds of assumptions, we actually have to get to know the person. The other piece that I want to mention, I'm going to open it up to questions. There are two other pieces I want to mention about what has really struck me in my journey to Islam and studying Islam, is the great joy I've had in studying the 99 names of God, and especially the concept of Tawheed, which is oneness, and meaning that to submit one's will to that oneness is really to embrace the whole of humanity. And the experience that my friend Abdul Rauf had when he went on Umrah, when he went to Mecca and did the walks around the center stone and came back also filled with this idea that every person on earth was there, every different kind of person, all walking as a collective humanity around the center stone to submit their will to the oneness of the Creator, and the idea that we are all family. I've also come to appreciate, and I know that sometimes Sufis and Sufism is not always well accepted. I've had many close Sufi friends, not American Sufis, but Sufis with lineage, let's say, for long lineage from their country of origin. And I just want to share this one story with you that to me really speaks to the beauty of Islam. And it is this. Once there was a sheikh who had students, and they were always bickering among themselves which one did the sheikh like the best, and which one was the most religious, and all of that. And the sheikh heard this, and it was getting him really annoyed, and so he decided, he called them all together one day, and he said, I'm going to have a test for you. And this is the test. The test is, I want you all to take a chicken, and I want you to go kill the chicken in a place that nobody sees you. No one sees you. And then come back, and the one who killed the chicken in the most secret place, then I'll tell you who my favorite student is. And they think, this is great. Meanwhile, the students all looked down on this one student who was a fool, a complete fool. They considered to be the most foolish. And that is the one that the sheikh seemed to like the best. And they could never understand this. And so they thought, this time, we are really going to make a fool of that fool, because that fool is not going to be able to do this. So the day goes, and they go out with their chickens, including the fool, and the sun goes up, and the sun is now just becoming dusk. And they come back to the sheikh's house, and they're all carrying their dead chickens by the feet, except for the fool, who has a live chicken in his hands. And they're all laughing at the fool. Ha ha, see what a fool you are. You couldn't even figure out how to kill a chicken. So the sheikh says, okay, so tell me. And one says, oh, sheikh, holy sheikh, I went to the top of the mountain. I was so daring, where I could see 360 degrees. And even though I could see everything, no one could see me. And I killed my chicken. So the sheikh said, and you? What about you? And the next student said, oh, sheikh, I went in my very own house, down to the basement of my very own house. And in a hidden room in the back, that's where I killed the chicken, and no one heard me and no one knew. I see. And what about you? The other one said, I went to the back of the cave, and I killed my chicken there. And the sheikh said, I see, you've all been very clever. And what about you, oh fool? And the fool said, well, sheikh, I too went to the top of the mountain where I could see everyone and everyone could see me. They couldn't see me. And I also went to the bottom of the basement in my house, and I went into the cave. But sheikh, wherever I tried to kill my chicken, I could feel the presence all around. I could feel the presence all around, and I couldn't kill my chicken. And the sheikh said, that's why he's my favorite student. Feeling the presence all around in every moment of every day, in every act that we engage. To me, that is where those who are seeking faith come together. And that is something that I have learned from Islam, to feel the presence all around. I'm sure you have questions, and I want to get to your questions. I know I've only really scratched the surface of my journey, but I'll open it up to you.
And if you raise your hand, I'll bring a microphone to you for your question.
And goodbye to the rest of you. Assalamu alaikum. And please feel free to ask me any question, no matter how provocative it might seem. Anyone? Yes. Just if you can stand, that would help.
I was just wondering how you suggest we do confront those who are violent. We don't have the chance to have those individual confrontations with everyone in every community. And maybe the media does overdo these stereotypes that have a negative effect on the majority. But even if those who are violent are a minority, they're still a threat to their own communities and to us. And I was wondering how your nonviolent principles can apply to those who are violent.
What I learned about the reasons for religious dialogue in Islam is to, and especially from a man named Tariq Ramadan, is that if you, the real question is, for us here, is what do we have access to? Who do we have access to? And to the degree that we have access, that's where we begin to work. And what we do is create enough relationships among and between our communities. We create those relationships so that when violence or conflict does threaten us, we have a large pool of oversight. Because violence happens when leadership has no oversight, which is why this country just changed Congresses, and they're still not getting the message. But what we have to do is create opportunities for interfaith and intercommunal dialogue so that we can understand why violence happens. Violence does not come out of nowhere. It doesn't arise on its own as a kind of disease. Violence occurs through attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and the certain worldview that people have. So number one, we have to start with ourselves and question our own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors before we start pointing the finger at other people. And that's why the idea of structural violence is so important to understand. Because we have a part in it. We have a part in it. I mean, we have learned, for instance, that sweatshop labor exists, right? That's not a surprise. Or we have learned that this country runs on undocumented laborer work, right? We've learned that. And yet we, as a nation, continue to cooperate with these with companies as consumers, because we still buy Nike and we still buy all the things which are made by sweatshop labor. We haven't given up on those. And so we are responsible indirectly for a lot of violence in this world. That's one thing. And the same with undocumented. How many people, are so riled up about undocumented labor, and yet we all benefit from it. All of us. In various ways. So before I start pointing my fingers, I have to look at how I am implicated personally, and then to create the structures of relationship building that is the only way to prevent or to intervene when violence starts. I've worked with a friend of mine from Northern Ireland, and she said that peace is kind of like this. You take a big rubber band and you stretch it for peace. But if you don't have the infrastructure between people, the thousands and thousands of relationships that you need in order to hold that peace, the peace will just go like that. this has happened in many situations. So there is no pill that you can take to end violence, but perpetuating violence does not end violence. So as a civil society, we have to be allies with those who are working toward an end of violence in our own communities, as well as cross-culturally and cross-generationally and so forth. Yes, back there.
With the state of Israel, because I really appreciate that you brought up that consumer capitalist point, and that to some degree this is a foothold for American imperialism, while to another extent it's a good thing to have post-Holocaust. But there's obviously a conflict here. Where do you stand with that in your experiences with the Palestinian and the Israeli community?
I weep every day. That has been the greatest challenge in my life. I am involved with other people, including Jewish people, to advocate for and request an end to military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. That's where I stand. I believe, with many of my Palestinian counterparts, in a two-state solution. Well, I don't know if that's really possible now, given the political situation and the degree of settlement in the West Bank. I work on trying to end home demolition and the uprooting of olive trees and access to roads, the end of checkpoints. This is all within Palestinian territory. This is not from Israel to Palestine, but this is within Palestinian territory. It is a tremendous struggle to do that without, to make one's way in that. There was some scene, I can't remember where it was. Oh yeah, I'm thinking of the Temple of Doom, I think, when the other guy, Harrison Ford, is, making it through all these obstacle courses to get to, that's what it feels like working on this. And, I've been working on this issue for 40 years, since 1966, really, a little more. And I'm constantly reevaluating with others how to get a grip on the situation. Right now, I'm working on a proposal. The UN has taught us that if you want to change violence in a community, start with the most marginalized women and give them economic and educational opportunity. And so now I'm working with another friend of mine to create that agency, those efforts, and to work with others in the West Bank in particular. Gaza, we can't even get into at the moment. There's a new counter to AIPAC that's forming, and I'll be part of that. It's with Brit Tzedek and a couple of other Jewish organizations. It is a great sorrow to me that any people, and in particular the Jewish people, because I'm one of them, would choose the option of militarism and military oppression as a way to preserve security. And as a pacifist and as a human being, I cannot support that. And I have talked and counseled too many young men who have returned from war to want to send any young person to war. And I will do everything in my power to encourage any young person who is thinking to go into the military to choose some other opportunity to work in behalf of your community, to serve your community and to make a difference. Because the truth is that there is no human being, as that famous Stanford study told us, when young people in college were divided into guards and prisoners, in 36 hours they had to stop the experiment because all the guards took their roles too seriously because there's no oversight. We know the psychology of what happens when you put young people, bright, wonderful, loving young people, in a circumstance where they are guarding an entire other people. It changes you. There is no way it doesn't change you. You become a killer. That's what happens. I can't support that. So that's where I stand.
This will be our last question.
I'm sure you must have experienced some very strong reactions from the Jewish community from having that stance and from
Yes.
taking so much interest in the Palestinian people and in the Arab people. And I'm wondering if you could speak to some of those reactions and how you were able to respond.
I want to say that the response varies, that you can't say the Jewish community any more than you can say the Christian community or as if somehow we're a monolithic group, because we're not. In those instances, when there have been national campaigns against me, for something that when I wrote an article that I was opposed to the use of torture. This was before Abu Ghraib and before the Israeli Supreme Court actually said, yes, there is torture, and I wrote about it. And so I experienced a national campaign. But as an activist, at least locally, what I could do is 6 months later, in my own community, I was able to organize 300 people from across the spectrum to come together before Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian from the territories in both government positions, like from Fatah, and there was a whole negotiation. The Federation chose 2 partners, and we chose 2, and then we both agreed on one together. And then we had mediators at every table, and we actually managed to get a dialogue going. We have to be able to speak about these things with each other and have different perspectives and opinions without hurting each other. So I just keep on keeping on. I mean, I imagine, I never try to create a situation where absolutely have a broken relationship. So I'm always looking for what is possible to say at any given moment and how much of what I know I'm going to share. My actions in this regard is not only in behalf of Palestinian peoples. It is because I don't see a positive future outcome in the current situation as it's being experienced in Israel. I don't see that as a sustainable for many generations. I know, for instance, that Protestants and Catholics have been added in Northern Ireland, due to structural violence for over 100 years. And we're more than halfway there ourselves. 500,000 people have left Israel. The Jews, 500,000. We're a tiny country. It's a tiny country. So there's many reasons to do everything that's humanly possible in my hands to create a different approach to this intractable situation. And as an American, I wish we would stop funding every side. I wish we would stop arming the world, And so as Americans, in case you don't feel implicated by that conflict, know that your tax dollars are funding this. So yes, there's a lot we can do dialogue-wise to begin talking to each other to find out what is our common ground and how can we proceed together to end militarism around the world. And once there was a rabbi walking down the street or I don't know which story to end with, but there was a rabbi walking down the street and two thugs came up to her and said, "Hey, Rabbi, what do we have in our hand?" And she looked and she saw a little feather come out of the hand and she said, "It's a bird." And they said, "That's right, Rabbi. Is it alive or is it dead?" And the rabbi thought, if I say it's alive, and if I say it's dead, maybe, So the rabbi looked at them for a little while and said, I don't know whether that bird's alive or dead, but it's in your hands. It's in our hands. So may we look at our hands and may we consecrate them every day to peace. Thank you. There is Fellowship of Reconciliation material in the back, and if you're interested, if you want to get involved on a national or local level, you can check out magazines and materials in the back. Thanks.